The world of radio lost a legend yesterday as the BBC Radio 2 DJ Steve Wright sadly died suddenly at the age of 69.
He was a fixture on the airwaves for more than 4 decades, but was unceremoniously dropped from his afternoon show in 2022 as BBC bosses looked to attract a younger audience. That plan backfired as the station lost more than 1 million listeners. Joining us now is former BBC local radio presenter Alex Dyke. Thanks for coming on board, Alex. I think you were you at Radio Devon, is that right?
No,
Solent.
I was at
Solent. Sorry,
Solent
my
in
mistake. My
Southampton.
mistake. Now, we're talking about ageism at the BBC. We know through sources at the BBC that when the BBC dropped Steve Wright, he was heartbroken. I think you knew him a bit, and you knew that Steve was one of those people. His job was his life. He was obsessed with radio. He was devoted to radio. And when they took him off Steve Wright in the afternoon, he was literally heartbroken. Now, we've seen other examples of ageism around the BBC. Liz Kershaw, who got dumped out of Radio 6, she's been talking about the terrible way that Steve was treated. We know about on the television, you got Question of Sport with Sue Barker. They took her off for ageist reasons. And guess what? An enduring hit that used to get 6 million viewers had to be axed 2 years later because it lost so many viewers. So not only would I suggest that the BBC is ageist, it self-harms with its ageism, but you were a victim of this yourself, were you not?
Yes, I'm afraid I was. The BBC worked very, very hard to tick all of the boxes apart from ageism. And I don't want to criticise the BBC. It was a great privilege to work for them for 15 years. But I really think they need to get this sorted out. And look at Steve Wright. Steve Wright is what we would call, Kevin, a national treasure. So if he was a national treasure, what do you do with treasure? You look after it. It's priceless. And that's what Steve was. You're so right. He reminded me of Benny Hill, really, in a way. Very private. Work was everything to him. He didn't spend his millions on yachts and Ferraris. His show was everything to him. He'd get in the morning at 9 o'clock and work on it. And when it was over, he would still stay in the studio working on the show for the next day. It was his absolute life. And we all benefited from that because it was, 4 decades of fabulous entertainment.
You, I think, had the pleasure of working with him, didn't you, at Radio Luxembourg in the late 70s?
Well, I was at Radio Luxembourg, but after Steve. The first time I ever heard Steve, I'd never heard him on local radio in where was he? Reading, 210 FM. I never heard him there, but I heard him on Luxembourg in '79, and I met him a few times in the corridors of the BBC, where he was always very pleased to say hello to fans. And I was a big fan of Steve. When I worked at the BBC, I was still a big fan of Steve. And I met him at a couple of discos where I was doing the warm-ups, and at the back of the Radio 1 Roadshow caravan, where I used to hang around as a teenager to meet my radio idols. And Steve was definitely one of those, and a very nice, caring, encouraging person to young broadcasters. And that's what he was doing for the radio of the future. He was caring for these young broadcasters who were coming up through the ranks. I don't think he ever expected to be replaced by a younger broadcaster.
No, and when they do this, Alex, it's self-harms. I mean, they got rid of Steve Wright, they got rid of Ken Bruce, they lost 1 million viewers. And they could say, oh, it's in pursuit of a younger audience. So they replace Steve Wright with sprightly whippersnapper 50-year-old Scott Mills. So that doesn't make much sense. And Vernon Kay is hardly, a teenager either. So I'm not quite sure where their thinking goes. But tell us how they got rid of you.
Well, I was very happy at the BBC. I was moved to weekends, which is always a bad sign for a daytime presenter. But in fairness to the BBC, they did actually create a Friday, Saturday and Sunday weekend show for me when lockdown came in. I was very happy with my ratings, so were they. And then one day on social media, I heard I'd been axed. And I tell you one thing that disappointed me, and I love the BBC, and I don't want to slag them off. But when I got to 60, my boss rang me, my program controller rang me and said, "Oh, hi, Alex." She was ringing about something else, and she said, "What's it like to be 60?" And I said, "Wow, it's just the same as being 47 or 35. I don't feel any different. I read it in the paper that you were 60. Then we had a conversation, and I said, am I going to get any more shows? And she said to me, well, not really. We're looking for a younger audience. Not being ageist or anything. And I thought, well, I think that was
ageist.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Also, need to get with the programme. The younger audience grew up with people, and those are the voices they want to listen to. And if they're not listening to radio, they're more likely to be listening to drill music on TikTok or something. So, you know, what is the point?
And Alex, we've got to go in a second, but what stuck in my craw was this avalanche of, Steve was a part of the Radio 2 family. Well, why did you sack him? He was so revered by the BBC. All these statements, basically hypocrisy. They dumped him. They dumped him.
Well, very quickly, Kevin, the one thing that Steve has, and not a lot of broadcasters managed to pull this off, Tony Blackburn has, his voice never changed. He still sounded very, very contemporary.
Yeah.
I mean, the BBC left him with love songs on a Sunday, but they did give him Pick of the Pops on a Saturday. So to have 2 national shows on the network wasn't bad at all.
It wasn't, Alex. Listen, it's great to talk to you.